The mystery of breath, Gatha 3:10, Pasi Anfas. Breath penetrates, breath permeates, breath strikes, breath absorbs, breath invigorates, and breath heals. It is therefore that souls with great powers make their thought and feeling penetrate into the mind and hearts of others. As breath creates an atmosphere, it permeates the bodies of others. Also the sphere, charging the whole atmosphere with its particular magnetism. The hearts of people are likened to gongs in the temple. Every spoken word strikes them, but by the power of breath, one strikes them without a word. It is by the breath that one contracts illnesses, but also one absorbs defects and the depression of others, as well as joy and happiness. The breath of personalities, healthy in mind and body, is vitalizing. The breath of the spiritual beings, whose love and sympathy go out to others, is naturally healing. It is no exaggeration that the whole phenomenon of life has breath as its mystery. And once the knowledge of breath is attained, and breath is mastered by practice, one beholds a most wonderful phenomenon within and without. There are many who remain skeptical till they have fathomed the mystery of breath. Once they know it, they call it, as Hindus have called it for ages, breath life. Moshe speaks here of the resonance of the breath, how the breath rings the gong that is within each human being. It vibrates and it sends out its vibrations, and whether consciously or unconsciously, everyone feels the vibrations of another's breath. And the most refined, the most subtle way to know another person is by sensing that person's breath. So one can know a little bit by looking at the form, the bearing, the gestures, look at the expression in the eye, the tone in the voice. All of these aspects of a person tell you something. But when you feel the rhythm, the length, the breadth, the vibration of that person's breath, you've entered that person's atmosphere. You've entered their psychic life. And so we influence each other in this way. And our breath bears the mark of our attunement, the nature of our thought, our emotion, our state of being. And that is conveyed, that's projected in a life field that extends out, it fills the room, and it does reach other people. So it's natural that we are drawn to those whose breath refreshes us, inspires us, where there is a sense of livingness above and beyond any words that might be spoken. And that first and foremost is the quality that one finds among the friends of God, those who are engaged in continuous remembrance, their breath becomes a sweet, a pure, a fine, a crystalline sphere. And to enter that sphere is to feel the vibration of the divine remembrance, of glorification, resounding. So Murshid concludes this whole series of papers by saying it's no exaggeration to say that breath is the inner mystery of life. Life is breath. Breath is life. And when we look back over the lessons we have studied, we can recollect the importance that breath plays in the body, how breath is the organizing principle in the body, how the circulatory system, but also the respiratory system and the digestive system and the nervous system, all of the living systems are enfolded within a life field that is animate, that is vital, that holds the whole organism together. And that's what we mean when we speak of the subtle breath. And this subtle breath is something that is not separate from the psyche. The mind enters the body through the breath and informs the body and even enhances its life by inhabiting the breath in the body. And there are channels through which breath moves in the body. Murshid speaks of the ancient Indian system, which refers to prana as the channel of breath that goes outward, and then the udana, which is the channel of breath that rises up. It rises, for instance, in speech, in articulation. And then there is the breath in samana, which is very much focused in the core and aids in digestion. And then there is the descending breath called apana, which facilitates excretion, but also procreative energy. And then there's the energy of vyana, the breath in the limbs, which impels the limbs in motion. So all of these different directions of energy and these physiological processes are manifestations of the vital essence of the life field moving through the body, and which is tangible in the functioning of the visible physical organs, but which also moves in channels which are not identifiable in any physical form, although they certainly correspond to physical features. So one thinks here especially of the sushumna, which is the central channel of the breath, which rises up from the base of the spine all the way up to the crown, and which functions as the central axis of the subtle body. And through this channel, the chthonic terrestrial magnetism is, could say, uploaded, and simultaneously the more transcendental, celestial energy descends. And so the central shaft of the body is primary to the anatomy of our life field. It's designated, its primacy is evident in the figure of the straight line, which signifies the number 1 and signifies in the Semitic alphabets the first letter of the alphabet, Aleph. And So you can see the straight line is primary. We intuit that because it's at the center of our own subtle body. It's a primary inner experience, the sushumna. So working with the breath, one more and more experiences this rising feeling and a descending feeling, and how heaven and earth communicate in the innermost sheath of one's form. And then alongside the sushumna are those channels known as Ida and Pingala, which are described in yoga and also in the teachings of Khwaja Moinuddin Chishti, who uses these same terms. Ida and Pingala are the left and right lateral channels, and in discerning these lateral channels, one discovers how the bifurcation of the body, which is so evident when we look at a face and see two eyes and two ears and two nostrils and then two hands and feet and so forth, how that bifurcation, that essential dualism of the body is evident also in the subtle dimension of the body. We know that the two sides of the brain correlate with the different sides of the body, and when one starts to work with the subtle breath, you see that the you might say the right hand of the breath has a Jalali aspect, a more forceful, dominant aspect, and the left hand of the breath has a Jamali, or passive, receptive aspect. And so in tuning into the breath and calibrating the breath, one discovers that the breath all through the day is constantly shifting between Jalali and Jamali modes. And normally we don't notice this. But when one does notice it, it's extremely beneficial, because one then knows what is one's inner disposition at that moment. And if at a moment one's energetic disposition is Jamali, is passive, then undertaking some external, extroverted task would be counterindicated. And likewise, if one is in the Jalali mode, one won't be able to successfully, subtly, passively receive something. So one learns to identify these shifts in the breath, which relate to the left and right lateral channels. And so a whole course of development is taught in Sufism and yoga to excavate the channels, to discover the lata'if, the subtle organs that are ranged along these channels and which are flowers of breath within the body. And these flowers of breath are like desiccated roots in the desert that are all dried up until rain comes and irrigates the arid soil and brings everything to life. And that's how we experience the conscious, pervasive breath as it moves through the subtle body and wakes up and stimulates the inner centers. It's like a desert that seemed dead that now bursts into life in greenery and in flowers. And the work of vitalizing the breath is for this purpose, so that the inner body becomes a garden. So breath has much to do with the vitalization of the subtle body. It also has to do with the balancing of the mind. Really, the breath functions as the interface between body and mind. And when the body dissolves, whatever has been absorbed into the breath of the body, that of the body's nature which the breath has, could say, harvested, that lives on as the subtle vehicle of the mind in the hereafter. And so the interface continues between mind and body through the breath. And in the mind, the rhythmic balance of the breath brings calm, brings clarity. When there was confusion, when there was a tumult of emotions and random thoughts, the balance of the breath brings clarity. Moshe invokes the old terminology of Sattva and Rajas and Tamas. Sattva is the breath that is in a very fine register, very serene, but it's not prone so much to activity. It's meditative. It's that breath that is tasted in moments of exquisite, passive inwardness that opens out into a sense of boundless spaciousness. That's Sattva. But then you have the breath which is known as Rajas, which is still clear, still rhythmic, but it's more dynamic and externalized. So that is the breath for achievement, for taking on a work and fulfilling it masterfully. It's a matter of being in a high state but fully attentive to the outer world and engaged. And then there is a third kind of breath, which is Tamas, which is tumultuous, arrhythmic, confused, murky, and that becomes very much at the forefront when one is agitated or one is taken aback and insulted and resentful and or worried and anxious and angry. All of these emotions tend to roil the breath and stir it up and create this unpredictable tumult where balance and rhythm and depth are lacking. And that's the state in which we have to be very careful, because almost anything that we would do or say in that state is likely to go wrong, and we're likely to regret it. So just to know the state of one's breath and to know, now my breath is in tamas, well then at least one has a strong measure of self-control. One can refrain from acting. Now I'm in this tamas cycle. Let me withdraw. Let me clear this before moving ahead. So the mind, when it does access the sattvic breath, can become capable of profound inspiration. Inspiration is like radio waves. They are, all of them here right now, all of the channels, all of the songs that are broadcast are all around us right here, but we're not tuned into them. So inspiration is tuning in to the superabundance of information on all levels of being that is present everywhere. And what enables this is a refinement and expansion of the breath, making the breath go in deep and out wide and arcing in great rhythmic waves. These are principles that we've been studying over these months, and God willing, our remembrance of these principles and our endeavor to put into practice the continuous remembrance, the consciousness of the breath, moment by moment, will lift up our minds and purify our inner bodies more and more. The Murshid of Hazrat Pir Murshid Inayat Khan went so far as to say, with profound insight, that in this path there is only one sin and one virtue. The virtue is the breath that is breathed in consciousness of the unity of being. And the sin is the breath that escapes in distraction and forgetfulness. Which is to say, all virtues, all kindness, all integrity, all wholesomeness, it all comes from presence. And what is the channel of presence? What is the vessel of presence? The breath itself.